This is part of an ongoing project that started years ago when I wrote a piece about the IRA as a public limited company, trying to take a business approach to terrorism as part of a business approach to organised crime. I'm going to revisit the prospectus for the IRA because I doubt you'll have seen it, and I think it's an interesting approach to analysing terrorist groups. Okay, now we have to work out, that's a button, yes. The article sort of originates, my whole approach to terrorism originates from a review article which isn't often enough studied, which is one by Anthony Arblaster, Terrorism, Myths, Meanings and Morals, published way back in 1978 in the journal Political Studies. And he identified 9 major problems with the literature, which I'm not going to go into, you'll be pleased to hear. And I've said they're led to the worst piece of copy editing ever. We're going to circulate the paper if you want it afterwards. I have to say that I am appalled by the way in which it has been copy edited. It wasn't me, honest. I do know what the end of a sentence is and what the beginning of the next sentence is, and I do know that you put the journal in italics and the title of the article in quotes, but there's an amazing mix towards the end, and it even manages to get my email address wrong. So, not a journal that has covered itself in glory. Okay, I'm going to run through the myths straight off, and then I'm going to sort of talk around them, if you like. I mean, the first myth is that we know what terrorism is. Terrorism is like organised crime. There is no accepted definition. What's his name? Alex Schmid, who actually has the consensus definition on Wikipedia, which we're not supposed to use, are we? You know, Wikipedia we must not use. We must actually, we'll never footnote it. Yeah, go to it, get the date, and then find another source. And that's what we all do. Well, he's actually said that he is no longer satisfied with his consensus definition and he's trying to rework it. I prefer to talk about paramilitarism, which is the sort of accepted lefty way of looking at things. Paramilitarism being the use of force, armed force, by non-state actors. Simply enough, it gives you a broader way of looking at things. You can include anything you want. You don't have to get into this business of, are they really terrorising us? You know, because if they're not terrorising us, they can't be terrorists. And you don't get into this business of just using it as a boo word. So, the reason why I say we also know how it differs from insurgency, I give lectures to staff colleges around the world, and one of the things I used to be asked to do was to distinguish between terrorism and insurgency. We don't talk about that anymore. We talk about alternative forms of warfare, and we accept that terrorism, insurgency, public disorder all coexist, all going on at the same sort of time. But that's another presentation. If you want to ask me back, I can talk about that another time, okay? Second myth is that we can draw a clear line between terrorism and organised crime. I did a presentation with John McFarlane at Safeguarding Australia last week, and we talk now about the terror organised crime nexus. This comes from Tamara Makarienko, a famous book, and she has done a lot of work suggesting how far it overlaps, how it overlaps, and various other things. The third point to be made, the third myth, is that everything a political movement with an armed wing does is terrorism. This is something that is a definition, or if you want, a description that's used by people who wish to cut funds off from political causes they dislike. So they try to prevent the selling of literature, they try to prevent the raising of funds for charitable purposes. It's all terrorism, it's got to be stopped. The fourth myth, terrorist organisations are Weberian pyramids. There is a boss of all the bosses who gives all the orders, and all the little terrorists scuttle about going, yes sir, yes sir. We should know from our studies of terrorism that terrorism is cellular. The whole point of terrorism is that the cells are independent. They have initiative. The first terrorist cell, you will remember, is in Dostoevsky's famous work, The Devils. Now, nobody ever reads Dostoevsky these days. It's very sad. Do you know in the 60s we used to have a book of the week as students? Yeah, really. We actually read a book a week. You know, we didn't just read the summary, the abstract of the article, and then get on to the first. We actually exchanged books, and we had time to read a book of any sort. So, the book of the week one year was Dostoevsky's The Devils, which is the description of the origins of terrorism in Russia. And the first five-man cell is described in that, and 6 blokes meet together, draw lots, and 5 kill the 6th. It's a security device, yeah? If you're all guilty of murder, you can't actually inform on the others without subjecting yourself to capital punishment, right? So this is the idea of the original five-man cell. We could go here into the unmentionable Nechayev, Bakunin and the rest, but wrong lecture, another time. Do read Dostoevsky's The Devils. Do your soul good. Myths 5 to 10. Terrorism is a homogeneous phenomenon. All terrorist groups are the same sort of thing. They are not. I personally distinguish 12 different types of paramilitary group. I mean, I prefer to use the term paramilitarism. I'm going to talk about terrorism because that's what we do, isn't it? We redefine everything in the first paragraph and then we carry on talking as if we'd not written the first paragraph. So that's life. You must be used to this. Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a sophisticated multi-million-pound business. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to show you the books of Al-Qaeda later. This is an American myth. New terrorism is so different that it invalidates all previous knowledge. This is a myth created by American academics, which means they don't have to read any British or Australian work published before 9/11. Okay? They can write ab initio on a tabula rasa. All a terrorist group does is fight. Terrorism is about using violence fighting. The 9th one, millions of dollars have been seized since 9/11. It's not true, but we'll get round to it. And finally, and this is a myth perpetuated by, of all people, FATF. I've forgotten what FATF stands for. Something. It's really so important. But there is no difference between terrorist money laundering and other forms of money laundering. Financial Action Task Force, I know. I was waiting for somebody to tell me. Okay, so I'm going to go into all these a bit at a time. The idea is that I'm going to pull some stuff out of the article because I was making the assumption that I was going to be dealing with grizzled academics who knew far too much about the subject and therefore I needed to be highfalutin. I see I'm dealing with young inquiring minds, which is much more fun for both of us and I don't have to be quite so basic. There is some good stuff in the article. I was surprised. Because, you know, you don't often reread your own stuff, but I was quite pleased with most of it, except for the spelling mistakes and the sentences that have a full stop in the middle rather than at the end. Okay, this is not supposed to be definitional. This is, you know, there's 2 ways of doing a definition, yeah? One is to be ostensive and say terrorism is ABC. The other is to build up a picture of what we are normally talking about. It's called ostensive definition making. We used to do this in the first class of the first year back at university when, you know, students were students and hardly anybody went. We were taught there were different ways of defining. The modern academic thinks there's only one. You make it up. So what we are frequently talking about, and this has to do with terrorism and organised crime, terrorism is the condition in a geographical area, and that area is not always contiguous. Yeah, that area can be a sort of archipelago on land, where the state has broken down such that individuals and groups are resorting to violence, either to build a new state. The bit in red isn't in the original article. I was giving this lecture at Kuwait Staff College, and the evil British officer who was there representing the United Kingdom pointed out that I'd forgotten international terrorism. So either to build a new state or states, or even to restore a pre-Western regional system not even based on states, the caliphate, yeah? Or, God help us, a post-capitalist world. Remember? There were left-wingers once who believed there was something beyond capitalism. Dreamers. They're either seeking to build a new state or to restore some of the services that the state used to provide, such as contract enforcement and security. Contract enforcement, I'm going to come back to. I am a gambetista, okay? We're all criminologists here. I can admit to being a follower of Diego Gambetta, and you'll all know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm a bit worried about the blank faces I'm getting back here. Famous criminologist from Oxford. No, okay, we'll talk about him in a minute then. Or to end a period of perceived exclusion. Yeah, so you have people in democracies who are excluded. Yes, we solve everything by voting, but certain categories of person are excluded because they can't become part of the majority coalition building process, yeah? In the UK, the classic group would have been Irish Catholics, always excluded. The condition of the state breaking down, which occasionally may be caused by a deliberate ideological attack upon it or by subversion from another state, is similar to that described by Gambetta in his account of the Sicilian mafia. That's why you see, you should know Diego Gambetta, because he wrote the definitive account of the origins of the Sicilian mafia in the 19th century. And I'm going to keep coming back to him, despite the fact that I've discovered that I'm not really a Gambettista. I'm a follower of D.C. Smith, who again you will be utterly intimate with. Smith was the guy who wrote the definitive stuff about organised crime as business, and that's where it all started. You know, we have different models of organised crime. Sometimes we talk about it as being a business. We talk about it as being aliens. You know, organised crime is always foreign. I don't know. I've just externaled a PhD in which he had a beautiful breakdown of organised crime definitions into 4 groups. Oh, unfortunately, I can remember 2 of them. The other 2 have lost. It'll come back. And so that state breakdown facilitates a parallel growth in organised crime, self-defence organisations, and family and friend-based illicit businesses. Okay? So some of these even create an underground or overground civil society, separate or not from that of the rest of the state, but often connected to other parts of the international NGO community. So what I'm talking about is places like Somalia, places like Afghanistan, places like, I've forgotten it, what's the other one? Libya, yeah, the new one. We've just blown Libya completely out of the water. Kosovo, Yugoslavia, all these sorts of places fall apart, and this is the sort of thing that happens, and we then send the army in to sort it out, and the army suddenly realise that actually they need the police in to sort it out, and then everybody realises that actually it would have been better if they'd asked the academics in the first place, because we might have given them some concepts. Yeah, give us a grant, give us a grant. I'd have to do, this is Walt Disney sponsored, okay? We have to use, the Smurfs are my sponsors here. Terrorism can be a business too. This is summing up a huge and long diatribe in the article that relates to Diego Gambetta and his heirs. And I'm sort of beginning to think I'm not going to do too much of this. But terrorism can be a business. You need to remember that violence is actually a service industry. People want to buy violence. You just had this case, it's ongoing, you know, about the police officer who allegedly bought violence in order to eliminate his problem person in jail. I'm sure it's not true, but that's the allegations that the papers are engaging in. But violence is particularly important in contract enforcement. If you can't take somebody to law, yeah, then you want somebody who's prepared to shoot their kneecaps off. then they won't cheat you. You want them to deliver the goods or you want them to pay for it. Now, if contract enforcement has collapsed, and this is Gambetta's argument about the origins of the Sicilian mafia, somebody who can use violence can enforce contracts. I've got a feeling I'm going to go into this in greater detail, but terrorists can sell that capacity. So you can have your drug trafficking protected by being under the brand of a terrorist group. So, cross-border transportation, he says at one point to Jim McCann, the brother of Joe McCann, he says, Jim, he says, you're trying to run guns. And if you're trying to run guns, you're trying to get money to buy the guns, and you've got to create a smuggling system. He said, if you're smuggling guns, think of yourself as being in the smuggling business. Why don't you smuggle drugs to raise the money to pay for the guns? Then you can smuggle them both together and make a profit. And Jim looks at him and he says something like, Howard, you're a genius. Another Guinness. He was Irish, you see. You probably think he was Scottish after my imitation there. Terrorists also need money laundering systems. They need systems of moving money. They don't need it in exactly the way that a criminal needs to launder money, but they need to move money from sponsor to the place they need to buy whatever it is they need to buy, or to place into the pockets of the people for whom they are fighting. So they need it also to create businesses, charitable works and stuff like that. And effectively there you see there's three services they can sell: violence, cross-border transportation and money laundering. But they can also sell smurfing. Now you see, I always assume everybody knows what smurfing is. And I'm discovering increasingly that it's actually a term used mostly in the Metropolitan Police and the DA's office in Manhattan. The original Smurfs were a bunch of blue-rinse granny ladies who used to help a drug dealer move his money from the drugs into various bank accounts. Yeah? And they called them Smurfs in New York because of the blue rinse. So they're little blue ladies wandering around. And if you think about it, a decent terrorist group will only keep about 100 people in the field, but it will have a couple of thousand people who want to be terrorists. You have to give them something to do for the cause. And smurfing is a good thing to give them to do. We found in the UK, North London, there was a huge scam going on. They had 40 Irish people, each of whom had 40 different identities, each of whom was claiming housing benefit and employment benefit. They were taking a couple of the identities for themselves and putting 38 back into the pot. It was a scam that was raising £5 million a year for the IRA. 5 million. Smurfing is big business by little people. Okay, microstructuring, I think, is the accepted academic term for it, okay? We call it smurfing. Now, this is where I was going to go back to the thing, and I need to explain a few things. What I try to do in the article is use some of the UN typology of organised crime groups, which is suspect, okay? I'm not saying it's gold, but I do think it has some interesting aspects to it, and apply it to some of the businesses of paramilitarism. Now, I need to get to a page here. This all links back into the Gambetta stuff, because if you look at those, standard hierarchy, single hierarchical group with strong internal systems of discipline. Think of that as a Leninist type of terrorist movement. Trotskyite, Maoist, yeah? There is a party directing the whole thing. But it's fairly rare to find that sort of organisation. More frequently, you want to think of terrorism as one of the following three. A regional hierarchy, where you've got regional control and discipline but relative autonomy for the actual cells, or where the security forces are strong, criminal groups which have a system of coordination and control ranging from weak to strong over all their various activities. So, clustered hierarchy, auditing as opposed to Weberian order giving. And their core group, lightly organised but unstructured group, surrounded by a network of individuals engaged in criminal or violent or whatever you want to call it, activities. Those different forms of network, I think, are useful tools. But I'm not going to go into them in great detail because you've got a paper to look at. This is all part of the argument about Gambetta. So, Gambetta, taken further by one of his followers, a Norwegian guy called Anvig, where the state is weak, it's difficult for suppliers and purchasers of goods to enforce contracts. If you can sell violence, you can become contract insurers and enforcers. So you will take the terrorist group as your brand. Yeah? If you're in the Yakuza, if you're following the Yakuza brand, you don't need to go to a terrorist group because they have their central group that will enforce. If you're in the Chechen mafias, the Chechens have the Obshak, the central shared security organization. And increasingly Russian groups, as they move into East Europe, have this Krysha system whereby they actually co-opt a police or army unit to deliver force on their behalf. So, what Gambetta argues, though, is that if you're selling violence, it's only a short step to becoming licensors of business activities, and a further short step to hijack some of those activities. Now, this is where we get into the problem of, are terrorist groups drug dealers? Yeah? My argument would be that terrorist groups actually franchise and license drug dealing. In the same way that they take money off legal businesses, they take money off illegal businesses. But there are situations in which individual cells will hijack those activities. And Gambetta's worth reading because he talks about how that happened in Sicily. It's also worth remembering that organised crime itself has a problem of contract enforcement. You can't go down to the police station and say, somebody just nicked 2 kilos of dope that I was trying to sell them. You know, the cops are not going to say, well, we'd better go and find it, sir. They're going to nick you. You need, if you need somebody to guarantee both payment and delivery of illegal narcotics and various other things. Now, this being a good academic paper, I have to remind you, the problem of terrorism is the problem of sources. We all get practitioner briefings all the time, and that's our main source, but we have to be cautious that we're not being used. I've had briefings, I prefer the briefings I've had from the Garda Síochána in the south to the briefings I've had from Met Men and spooks and MI5 people over on the UK. But actually I like to have both, and I like to be able to try to compare them. We can be used for propaganda and frequently are. Newspapers, we know, exaggerate stories to sell papers. I take you through in the article a series of scare stories from the Sunday Times. If true, the IRA would have controlled the whole of South African organised crime, half of Australian organised crime, and most of Sweden. By definition, they couldn't have been true, because if they were true, they'd have simply bought Britain years ago. Supergrassers and defectors make things up. They have to in order to keep their credibility, keep their safe house, keep their money from the dear old spooks and intelligence services. We've just had yet another court case go down in the UK and a serious attack on supergrass systems by a very senior High Court judge. Sometimes intelligence sources play down events. Sometimes the new right plays them up to push through their own agenda. So remember, all the data for the stuff I'm going to try and put before you is dubious. Yeah? You have to rely on my critical faculty to say that it's relatively true. I gave this presentation in about 1989. Somebody said, come on, Bill, do a piece on terrorist financing. And I created 3 slides, which were a sort of spoof prospectus from the IRA asking for investment, describing what it did. I don't use the first slide anymore. There's some good jokes on it, but we ain't got time. When I finished giving it, large men wearing suits and large shiny shoes surrounded me and said, "You're not publishing this." I said, "What do you mean, academic freedom?" They said, "Nah, you're not publishing this." I said, "Well, why not?" They said, "Well, the trouble is, it's accurate." They said, "And we want to talk to you about where you got this from, first and foremost. But secondly, it's rather embarrassing because what you've done is added it up. We've never added it up. We know this, but we've used it as a way of following the money to try and find sleeper cells. What I did was add it up and discover that on income of 20 million a year, the IRA was making a profit of 15 million a year. And what they should have been doing was trying to work out where that was being invested. Do you ever, I said this the other day, John, you didn't know about it either. I'm reliably informed by an Australian spook of great repute, who will remain anonymous, that the second largest baked potato chain in Australia was a repository of their investment. But nobody seems to know that there are baked potato chains in Australia. So my point about sources, I think, is borne out. The third largest pizza chain in the United States probably was a recipient. But actually, a lot of it went into Derry and West Belfast. It went into businesses. Just to sum it up, what am I sort of saying here? First thing to note is demolition equipment and executive toys. The IRA received one hell of a lot of kit from Colonel Gaddafi, 1973 and onwards. The Garda Síochána gave me a piece of paper charting what kit had been delivered. And I knew there'd been 3 shipments. I knew there'd been a 1-ton shipment, I knew there'd been a 2-ton shipment, I knew there'd been a 4-ton shipment. What I didn't know was that there'd been a 60-ton shipment. And that 60 tons included 3 tons of Semtex, it included heavy machine guns, it included rocket-propelled grenades, it included all sorts of stuff that the IRA never used. It was cached, and it was cached ready for an anticipated civil war in Belfast. Now, again, hey, sources, why were they telling me this? And what was the point? The only point in which I've used it is that the weird thing about the IRA was that they didn't actually need to raise money for weapons. They had them. The only thing they didn't have was good sniper rifles. And those they did purchase from the United States. So, demolition equipment and executive toys. I have another slide. Oh no, the next slide shows I actually include depreciation on those. A good accounting tool. Contributions from overseas subsidiaries. Well, that's you lot. It's NORAID in America, it's Australian support organisations, it's Swedish support organisations. Every time the British killed a couple of people, you remember the 3 shootings in Gibraltar when they killed 2 guys and a girl? That actually brought in 5 million in the following 12 months for the IRA. It was a great success. The percentage, I mean, I think about 70% comes from the United States, came from the United States, but about 10% came from Australia, 20% from around the rest of the world. So that was something the British were always trying to chase down, but it was very difficult to stop. But that wasn't not anything like the biggest source. Shebeen subsidiaries. The IRA ran pubs and clubs. because from the early days in Belfast, if you were a Catholic and you wanted to go out drinking and you wanted to get home, you had to get a taxi. And unfortunately, Protestant taxi drivers would actually take you home and kill you. So increasingly they created shebeens, illegal drinking dens, in their own areas. And in those, not only did they get the bar profits, but they also had the dear old slot machines. And they got quite a lot of money on those. Those were slowly legitimised, and eventually the anti-racketeering brigade began to tax them. So that there was some interesting stuff done there. But around about 1990, about 4 million a year coming in from the clubs. Import-export business, 2,250,000. That is counterfeit products. Big trade in counterfeit products. As far as we know, no drugs as such. They once tried to import drugs and there was a revolt in the Belfast Catholic ghettos. And it took them about 6 months to get credibility back. Where the drug thing comes in is in fire and bomb damage insurance. Protection PLC. Nice little bakery you've got here, sir. Pity if it burnt down. Sorry, I should be doing an Irish accent there, shouldn't I? That was a London accent. I'm not good at accents. I do apologise. I won't try to do an Australian one. It does. Well, it's a Monty Python sketch, you know. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Yeah? The Bishop. Do you remember the Bishop? Well, it's an actual line from that. He comes in and he goes, "Nice little tank you got here, General. Pity if it caught fire. If you paid me $1 million a year, I would make sure that none of your tanks caught fire." And, well, okay, you've not obviously not seen it. I think it's very, very funny. If you're a cannabis dealer, you wouldn't be a heroin dealer, in theory, but there was heroin dealt. If you're a cannabis dealer and you don't want your kneecaps shot off, you're going to be paying to the IRA. And they also ran a very good line in ecstasy. If you went down into the border counties, which I once made the mistake of doing with my children, and my great big red nose on the front of my car, which was basically saying, "English idiot," driving round border counties. If you went into a pub, the whole of the back was opened out for clubbing. And you could sort of work out number of pubs in the village, number of places to go clubbing, number of people, demand for ecstasy tablets. And huge amount of ecstasy tablets. This is called research, by the way. You know, this is risky research. I told my daughter, do not cross the border into a border county. She'd, yes. Couldn't see the border because it was a river. Yes, I think I'm going to have to train you up a bit better than that. But 6 million or so anyway, coming in through protection. Construction. Well, I mean, one of the things they did, if you wanted a new hotel, you ring up and you say, "I need some urban renewal, please. You don't fancy blowing up my hotel so I can get a new one off the government?" I mean, you know, corruption, people are that crooked. The IRA reconstructed every little town centre throughout the whole of Northern Ireland, and they also ran a construction company which built it up again. I mean, this is sort of August Blanqui gone mad, you know, digging holes and filling them up. Involuntary bank and post office contributions, that's actually a set of figures given me by the Garda Síochána. They gave me a set of figures for a 10-year period, and they said 30% of that is IRA training missions, blood in them. This really annoyed Special Branch in the UK. Why are they telling you when they won't tell us? I'm a travelling academic. I do objective research. If they told you, that would be betraying information to the enemy. All right. Oh, I've gone backwards. Aha, that was interesting. Here's the expenditure. I'm saying this was when they'd moved on from 5-person cells into 2 persons supported by a group. So actual executives in the UK, that's on the mainland, sorry, that should be GB rather than UK, there would have been 2. And I reckon, 4, I reckon they were paid 20,000 a year. That's a reasonable figure, yeah? To be paid for blowing people up and killing them. Warehouse and support staff, I reckon there would have been about 20. Their job was to provide safe houses, hide the gear, and do surveillance of targets. So that's your intelligence organisation, it's your support organisation. I reckon they had about 20 of them. So I'm really talking about 4 or 5-man cells supporting 4 permanently based executives. They would also have brought people over from Northern Ireland. Executives in Northern Ireland, again, I've heard if you take it, I think I'm paying them slightly less, and I don't know why the figures disappeared. And warehouse and support staff, subtotal of all that lot, that's full-time, about $1 million, if you're assuming they're paid 20,000 in the UK, they're paid less in Northern Ireland because they're getting benefits, yeah? And then payouts from the Executive Family Insurance Fund, that's widows and orphans. Most of that is covered by NORAID. Yeah, but that's what legalises the NORAID donations, because it's donations to families. Semi-retired staff south of the border, that's the leadership, if you like. I reckon they were getting about $1 million. So I'm now down, see, I've put some depreciation in on the demolition equipment. I've decided to, I was saying 15 million, I've reduced it to 13.5 million. And that's available for investments. I've also allowed them a petty cash fund of 745,000. So I think this is quite an interesting little tool to use with a terrorist organisation. Where's the money coming from? Where's it going to? It's easy to work out an estimate of how many people there are in the field, and you have to assume they're getting paid. Bin Laden has given us that information at different times. He was only, the Chechen people were only costing him $1,500 a year. Iraq, I think he said, was costing him $100,000 a week. And those are direct quotes from Bin Laden, well, via an Israeli website. So, source problem, but they are apparently things that are from his speeches. Okay, so that leaves us with some interesting questions. What's the relationship between a paramilitary and its political movement? Are they independent? Does one control the other? Does the gun command the ballot box, or the ballot box command the gun? If there's a business of fundraising, how does it fit between the two? Are there separate funding streams, or is there one central paymaster doling it out? The IRA had a quartermaster. How many autonomous components are there within the organisation, and how does the autonomy vary? And that in the paper I go back then to the UNODCP typology and try and say a bit more about it. It's a bit difficult to do without reading the paper out word by word, and I'm sparing you that. It may be morning, but I don't want to put you to sleep, John. Stay awake. Can you do a typology? Can you produce a typology by financing? That was the next question I was asking myself in the paper. Variables seem to me to be a mixture of territory, structure, and business. So you've got a group abroad, in exile. You've got maybe a national group. You've got maybe regional groups. You've got maybe city groups. They all may be raising funds in different ways. They may be receiving funds in different ways. The structures will be different in the cities and in the rural areas, and the businesses being followed will be different in different parts. You can sell more in cities, you can raise more by protection rackets than you can in the rural areas. You know, there's not a lot to be gained by going around saying, nice cow you've got here, farmer. Pity if it got a flying lesson. Even the bishop didn't say that. So, where are they financed? How, by whom, when, and for what? And here you've got a big difference, I think, between Al-Qaeda and the IRA. Lot more central financing of specific operations by the central command of Al-Qaeda. Very few such operations, but most operations had to be agreed by the Army Council. Most big operations, certainly any operation on the mainland, had to be agreed by the Army Council. What's the mix of state financing, illicit business financing, levies on supporters in the sense of members of the diaspora group, wealthy individuals, protection, charities, petty crime? What's the mix? And that's a matter for, you put your own version of my IRA input-output profit and loss diagram together. I've tried to do this. I don't actually think I can demonstrate that it is worth going about typologizing terrorist groups by financing. This seems to work better for goals and aims. This is the lecture I've been giving to military audiences since about 1971. So it's not improved a great deal in that time. All I've had to do is change the examples. We still have anti-colonial and nationalist groups. They still are state-sponsored. They still get donations. Most of them now, China, some in the remnants of Russia. Those would be the last great empires, although you can argue about whether the US system is an empire or not. Ethnic, religious and cultural minorities, separatist groups. Europol, the report says, there's hardly any activity by Islamic fundamentalists in Europe. It's the old separatists. It's IRA dissidents. It's the Corsicans. It's the Basques. Worth looking at the Europol report. We are throwing a lot of money at de-radicalization and the rest. There's not a lot going on. Ideological minorities of the left. Who? I mean, what happened to the Marxists? Did it just get too hard to read all that stuff? We do have, the anarchists are still out there, thank goodness, but the Marxists seem to have, and they have a long tradition of bank robberies because it's anti-capitalist, yeah? It's revolutionary to rob a bank. You'd expect them to be coming back. The ideological minorities of the right, which we've not been looking at properly, wealthy individuals tend to sponsor them. Tends to be nutters, rich, right-wing, American nutters are the people from whom you can get money. The left, got to be careful about this. Let me throw the concept of pre-terrorism at you. It's not in the paper. Pre-terrorism is a concept the French developed. And there were great fears about this. I can refer you to an article by some bloke called Bill Tupman called Anarchy in the EU in Jane's Intelligence Review that reviews whether we do have a condition of pre-terrorism. We don't yet. We have the black blocs, we have the climate camps, but what is left of the left is still into non-violent direct action, with the exception of the black blocs who do things like smash shop windows and then stand back while the idiots loot. Rational really, isn't it? Urban guerrilla groups large enough to have a serious chance of overthrowing government. It's not happening. At the moment, it's not trendy. The internationals I'm not really going to go into, except that the Islamic fundamentalists, we now call them jihadists. Takfiri is the accepted term, by the way, now. Even calling them jihadist is being a bit anti-Islam. You've got to call them takfiri, which is the Islamic equivalent of heretic. Yeah, that's okay. And remember that most stuff done is done by unorganised imitators. It's always been that way. We shouldn't be surprised when individual nutters blow themselves up. They always have. I did a very primitive piece of analysis way back when. The Weathermen, that well-known American group, FBI said every 10 bombs that were going off in America, only 3 were being planted by the Weathermen as a group. 7, they said, were being planted by cranks. I love the term, the scientific nature of cranks. But that ratio was not borne out in the UK. It was more like 1 to 4. 1 bombed by the IRA, 4 by others, until we discovered there were 2 bunches of anarchists who nobody had noticed, who launched their campaign the same day as the IRA did on the mainland. They got mopped up pretty fast, but it didn't half mess up my figures. I don't know to what degree you can actually see this. This is an attempt to apply the same principles to Al-Qaeda. This is Osama bin Laden as Superman, yeah? And this is where he was supposed to have a personal fortune of 300 million, which he was pouring into this massive international organization. He personally owned businesses in the Sudan, Yemen and elsewhere, 35 different businesses, including forests in Uzbekistan, Turkey and the rest of it. The combined turnover would be worth working out. But of course, several of them used as shell companies, simply to set up methods of launching an attack in a particular place. He got more money from charities and donor persuading facilitators. Well, I say he got more, about 30 million a year. That's pretty well documented. He may have dealt drugs. This is what they said. He had the monopoly of tanzanite. Go on, who was the famous wearer of tanzanite? It's from the Titanic. Bird on the prow, you know, my heart will go on and all the rest of that nonsense, romantic idiocy. She was wearing a tanzanite necklace and it took off. Everybody, all you women wanted tanzanite necklaces. We wanted tanzanite cufflinks, John. Massive amounts of money. He was also supposed to have the monopoly of the diamonds in Sierra Leone. Also supposed to be money coming from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. Suspected internal US sources. Suspected he manipulated the stock markets. The total was astronomical. More than any paramilitary organization could ever successfully spend. Now, source. Source is an Egyptian who fled having embezzled $10 million and turned state's evidence and threw himself on the mercy of the CIA. Might just be suspect. Secondly, this is when he was in the Sudan and he was setting up companies to help the Sudanese sanctions bust. Everything that was in the Sudan was confiscated by the Sudanese government when he was forced to leave for Afghanistan. So whether it was there or not, an interesting research project for somebody to see if they could make any of it stand up. But the truth, this was the commission, the 9/11 Commission's verdict. The Saudi government had forced his family to sell his share of the family business, and he was receiving $1 million a year up to 1993-4. So $1 million from family sources. All appropriated, the businesses 1996. Still getting $30 million a year from the charities and the facilitators. Drugs, mythical. Precious stones, mythical. Foreign government, mythical. Internal US sources, non-directly, but maybe some coming through the charities. Stock market manipulation, mythical. Total 30 million. Now that is an American account. They have revisited it, I gather. The 9/11 Commission has revised its report. I have to confess, I only found out after arriving here. I do apologise, but this is about my 7th presentation in a week. I haven't had time to read it all through. So, what's the story? They said the real point that nobody really understood was that Afghanistan is not a cash-based economy. Cash wasn't what he needed. It was goods. And how that was done is a different matter. I've missed out 2 or 3 slides. You lucky people, we're coming to the end. This is our, I think, the final slide. You may remember we started with 10 myths, yeah? I've sort of been going through them steadily one by one, honest. I just haven't shown you them in numbers. The last great myth is the myth of the seizures. The Americans haven't even told us anything about seizures since 2008. The Senate Commission concerned has said, oi, come on, what are you doing? We've given you all these powers and all these resources. What are you getting? The majority of money seized is still the money seized from Al-Barakat and Al-Taqwa. Al-Barakat, they were basically Halala-style banking methods of repatriating money from Somali workers to Somalia. Yes, there may have been some Al-Qaeda elements skimming in those charities, but they certainly weren't wholly Al-Qaeda supporters, and there have been several American court cases. They still haven't got the funds back, but they have been found to have been, whatever the correct word is in American law. It shouldn't have been done. Several cases going through the courts about US charities. I was an expert witness in one, and it terrified me in the end because the amount of smearing of witnesses that was being done by a foreign state that will remain nameless meant that I thought, I'll take the money at this point and I'm not going to appear in American court. I just don't want somebody chasing me and denouncing me for the rest of my life. Pursuits of other charities, all this has really been aimed at Hamas, the Arab Bank and the Palestinians. Very little has been aimed at Al-Qaeda. The seizures have... There was some initial seizures in the first couple of years. Most of these seizures since have been questioned in American courts and most have been returned. There hasn't been great success in this area. If you watch the UN, if you did a chart of it, it goes like that. And that's the end. About time, I suppose, really. Gives you a chance to get some lunch.